in Illinois.
Correct.
And the American who I mentioned, Andrew Ivy, he was the medical consultant at Nuremberg, felt very uneasy because he had himself participated in these experiments with the prisoners in Chicago. And they said to the defense lawyers, said to the prosecution, okay, look, you've been doing the same things. You've been experimenting, so what is the difference in what you have been doing and what the Germans and the Nazis had done? And he felt very, to put it mildly, uncomfortable. So he came home to Chicago and he approached the American Medical Association in 1946 or 47, and he had points, Andrew Ivy. He wrote actually only 3 points. One of them, I think, was informed consent and do no harm and whatever, and he approached the American Medical Association, who did not have strict formal guidelines for research, human subject research, and they said, okay, we'll appoint a committee, and they called the committee a Green Committee, and this committee was going to meet. It never met. But Andrew Ivy's points were published in the JAMA, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and he went back to Nuremberg and he said to the court, okay, you see, we have guidelines. And they said to him, yeah, but when were these guidelines written? And he admitted during the court that they were written in response to what he was expecting to be asked and what he was asked of by the defense during the court. And he said, this is what the Green Committee has decided, but the Green Committee, he was actually on the verge of committing perjury. The Green Committee never met. So, in fact, the Americans did not have guidelines. During the trial, the first American Medical Association's human subject research guidelines were formulated, and in response to what the Nazi Germans had asked, the prosecution had asked, the defense had asked, sorry. I'm in no way saying, of course, that the Americans, the malaria experiments were unethical in that probably the prisoners didn't receive any form of, were never asked for consent, but they certainly weren't the brutal, cruel experiments with the aim of maiming or killing the patients that the Nazis were. But they certainly were unethical, and there are parallels, there are similarities.
I mean, they weren't torture.
Yeah, of course.
But remember that the hepatitis experiments go on in the 60s with children whose parents are told, gee, we don't really have places for your child in this mental institution. However, if they come into the medical ward, then they'll have better food and better care. And by the way, they'll participate in experiments. So doesn't that sound better?
Tessa, we were speaking earlier about the German medical schools and their teachings, and this kind of goes off of the question that we have just discussed. Many people think that there was no code of ethics, that German physicians during the Holocaust were completely unethical, and that everything they were doing was nothing short of torture. You recently published a paper that describes the ethical and moral education in German medical schools in the early 1900s. So my question for you is, first of all, can you, I know you did talk a little bit about this in your lecture, but could you again go over some of the highlights of what German medical ethics, what their code of ethics was like at that time? Why it's so important for us to understand that there was, in fact, a code of ethics, even if it's not one that we today would subscribe to, and also how much you feel that kind of the indoctrination of that code was responsible. Everyone is always looking to try and figure out how could the doctors have done this? How could people do such a thing? What role do you think that the German Code of Medical Ethics played in all of this?
Okay, I'm not going to give a very broad answer. I think I've talked enough about it. But what is important is that they were taught. They thought that this was right. They thought that this was the proper way to perform medicine. There are doctorate theses done by medical students that were found in an American forget which university, where German students did theses on sterilization. Six papers have been published where they did thesis on sterilization. What is ironic is that they dedicated them all to their mothers. The students dedicated to their mothers. And they detail in they give great details how these people were sterilized and why and what the family background was and what the reasoning was, and there's absolutely no discussion at all about the ethics, whether it was correct, whether it was not. These people came from a certain family where they were mentally retarded children, and so that the others had to be sterilized. It was considered that was what was right, and that's what's so scary. They were taught that it was right, they thought that it was right, and they behaved as if it was right.
Tessa, I've always been fascinated by whether what permitted that distortion was the concept, the central place of the concept of the Volk. Could you talk a little bit about that?
The folk, the state, the nation, the making kind of the duty, as I said, dual loyalty was non-existent. They had to be loyal to their nation, to their country, to their state. I think it's, I don't know, there's something very attractive to this holding of power that attracts physicians. I think that Omar, I read an article that you published about from a psychological point of view. Maybe you can answer why you think there was something so attractive.
Yes, sure. Well, on the question of what it was about the Volk, it's not specific to Germany either. If you think even in any nation where you have the social organism becomes sacralized or becomes moralized as an entity with its own rights and interests above the individual. And I think the great contribution of the Western tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, is the dignity of the individual, which does get undermined in various ways, both in the Weimar Republic, but also in our own age, for example, with utilitarian ethics, where you're obligated to kill one to save five, and so on. In that context, it was more about the community is always prior to the individual, coming out of various philosophical theories. So I think that might go to your question.
Very much so.
Omar, while you're speaking, while you have the mic, again, I think most people are under the assumption that these physicians, they were crazy. How could they do something like this? How could anybody who's dedicated to healing do the things that these people did? And I think that, again, yes, obviously some of it has to do with kind of the paradigm at the time where, the Volk was the patient as opposed to the individual, so the idea of the greater good. But also, I think there are specific characteristics or vulnerabilities in the culture of medicine and the psychology of doctoring that makes physicians vulnerable to these kinds of ethical violations. And I know that you've done a lot of work in this area, so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the question of what specifically it is within kind of this culture of medicine that could possibly allow something like this to happen.
Yeah, it's, well, I would ask the audience to imagine what's the difference between a literature professor and a doctor in terms of personality and psychology, or a philosopher versus a doctor, right? So every profession has its own personality profile and some distribution. Obviously, everyone's unique. But if you can imagine in Germany, there are vulnerabilities. Why did the doctors join, right? You could think there's vulnerabilities specific to the profession, and there's vulnerability specific to from the historical context, economic context. So in terms of the profession, doctors tend to have a profile of being very conscientious, as do professionals and managers in organizations. So conscientiousness is good, but it also means if there's a protocol, you're going to follow it, even if you don't really think it's the right thing to do. You might just follow it anyway. So whereas if you're a kind of introverted philosopher, English professor, you might say conscientiousness, I'm going to do it my own way. I don't like this way anyway. These people are whatever. So, and then other agreeableness. So thinking about personality variables, agreeableness is the variable of do you have a need to get along with people? Dissenting is kind of tough if you're really agreeable. To be a good doctor, you have to get along with people, teams, dyads, families. So to the extent that you're a little bit more agreeable than normal, you're also going to be a little more agreeable to not dissenting when you should. Now, think about have everyone been to a graduate seminar in the humanities or social science? These people are not agreeable, right? They're going to rip apart everything you say before you finish saying it. So that personality variable is important too to think about. I'd say third, maybe extroversion, because to conform, extroverted people tend to conform a little easier than introverted people. And again, doctors are a little more social than probably your average, college professor. Openness to experience is a big personality variable that predicts political conservatism versus liberalism. If you're really open to experience, you'll, you might just want to try things for their own sake, try new things. And dissenting is new ideas that are dissenting ideas from kind of what you like to do will be really likely to come to your mind. Whereas if you like structure, order, predictability, you're going to be low on openness to experience. So being low on openness to experience predicts a little more conservatism. So the dissenting ideas, the idea that maybe I shouldn't do this, probably is a little less likely for the physician versus the biologist, the Ph.D. biologist. In the same way, respect for hierarchy, anyone who's worked in a hospital knows, respect for hierarchy. Hierarchy is an important way in which militaries and other hospital-type organizations function, but respect for hierarchy can also be undermining of ethics if the hierarchy sucks. Those are some things I see as personality variables in doctoring, but then obviously there's stuff specific to being in the Nazi context, like the things Tessa talked about with the sort of moralization of biological explanation, even if it's pseudoscience. Doctors have a proclivity for biological explanation, and the Nazi doctrine was explicitly salvific by means of biology. And there's always something seductive to thinking our science will give us ethics, and you can see why doctors might have gone for it, because then the quintessential doctor is the leader of the country, and you yourself are, as a doctor, thinking of yourself in this glorified role, basking in reflected glory. So you imagine why. By the way, so 50% of doctors were early joiners of the Nazi Party, which is an amazing number because almost 50% of the doctors at the time were Jewish. So it's almost like 100% of the non-Jews were jumping into the party, right? Compared to any other profession. And compared to your average German male who's working, the doctors were about 7 times more likely to join. So even especially psychiatrists.
There you go.
There you go. So you could imagine that there's something really particular to the ideology that attracted the doctors. Other things are, I'd say, the Nazi ideology medicalized political conflict. And so I think that's one of the lessons you take. Oftentimes it's very seductive to want to bring politics into the ethics of doctoring. But you can imagine an authoritarian or totalitarian politics undermining medical ethics, but so could a purely libertarian ideology, right? Imagine your entire politics is libertarian. That can go into a hospital and make the market the ultimate arbiter of who enters into caregiving. So I think that's something you see there too in that particular context. Doctors want to fight mortality, right? Nobody goes into medicine because they don't care about mortality. And Hitler was offering a sort of symbolic mortality, a regime that will last 1,000 years. If you're going to work every day, not thinking of your job as fighting against sickness and mortality, maybe it's not something that will easily come to mind. So maybe that was also a vulnerability. And we know that the profession was especially vulnerable, medical profession at the time, because of economic insecurity and competition for patients and things. So I think those are the historical economic reasons that I think combined with the psychological variables.
Yes. Go ahead, Ira, you want to?
Well, I would love to hear your thoughts and also the thoughts of the panelists on this. I always find it so interesting how we say, doctors joined the Nazi Party. I can't believe it. They took a Hippocratic oath. How could they go and break that oath and join the Nazi Party? And I mean, in one respect, I understand the Hippocratic oath is a performative statement where you think that it obligates you, and therefore, you're breaking some sort of like contractual obligation that you made with yourself. But when you think about the efficacy of a verbal declaration versus the a situationist frame, or even habit formation in keeping resilience in your ethical positions that you would hold despite what would necessarily the environment that you're in, it seems like the oath is kind of like a throwaway almost, where great, they made the oath, but how much of the oath would be actually productive or efficacious given the temperaments that you're mentioning, the habits that physicians had in their professional experiences, and also just the situation that they were in socially and politically.
Absolutely, and I think that's an amazing point. So if you think of a declaration as something that's factual, deliberative, it's propositional. You read about it and you think about it, and then you go on with your life. Whereas maybe it doesn't filter into your habits and the way you form your character. There was one very famous experiment of moral philosophers, and whether they were like how often they called their mother compared to the average person, or whether they held the door, or kind of their everyday ethics. And you might want to guess whether they're thinking all day about Kant and Hegel, and maybe not Hegel, but Kant and Aristotle and Maimonides. And so it turns out they're no more likely to do any of those nice, kind things than any other person with similar education, age, and so on. So ethical deliberation seems to not go very deep unless it's combined with self-cultivation, practice, ritual, and other things. So that's a great point.
I'm sorry, Iri, I'm just going to chime in for 1 second. I couldn't agree more with what everybody here is saying, right? So declarations are fantastic, and oath, it's great. Obviously, you're putting out there, this is what you want to be doing, this is what you're committed to. But the way that we're really going to make a difference now, moving forward, is by listening to this group of people here, and by going home and actually thinking about what they said, and then going out in your own lives and using these lessons. And that's the reason why it's so important to continue talking about this, not just from a historical point of view, but also in terms of the relevance for modern society. How can we use this moving forward to ensure that something like this does not happen again? I'm sorry for stepping on your toes, Irit. Go right ahead and answer.
No problem. So I just wanted to add a couple of semi-related points to that, which is, first of all, in the early 90s, I worked for the Israeli government in Germany, and so I lived there for 4.5 years. This was, as I say again, the early 90s, not the 60s, not the 70s, the early 90s. In the early 90s still, children were, it was decided in the school by the end of the 5th grade which children were going to go to gymnasium, the regular high school, and which children were going to Volksschule, which were the professional schools. So at that point still, the society was so stratified, and the respect for certain professions was so high that when I had to speak on the phone as a representative of the Israeli government, formally, to some people, if they happened to be doctors, I had to address them in the following way. Herr Professor Dr. Steinert. And if I spoke to the wife of Herr Professor Dr. Steinert, I had to say, Guten Abend, Frau Herr Professor Dr. Steinert. This is the truth. So, and also, having grown up in Israel in my time, the physicians were still, a lot of them, Jewish German physicians. And I really, really have a very sort of personal experience throughout the years, myself, my family, my parents. I have a very personal experience of, something that doesn't exist anymore in our society, where you couldn't ask a question of the doctor because that was impertinent. That was immediately a sign of unbelievable rudeness. And one time when I went with a good friend of mine and he asked the doctor a question, the doctor opened the door and said, Raus, in German, out you go. So we have to also kind of take that into account, and how well We've been influenced now by the internet and a much more sort of egalitarian view of all kinds of things. And then I also wanted to throw in just a mention in terms of what to do about it and how relevant it is today, without getting bogged down by particular empirical, studies. I will say that we see quite disappointing results for all of those wonderful programs that we have in the schools about anti-bullying and the fact that they're not really effective. And we look at our universities and we see all kinds of data suggesting that the millennials are very, very interested at an abstract level in all kinds of good things, the climate control and all kinds of other egalitarian issues. They're much less tending to stereotype, but interpersonally, they are much less caring of each other. We have incredibly high rates of sexual assault on campuses by students, against students. We have all kinds of other indications that interpersonally they're very narcissistic, while abstractly, philosophically, very. And the question is, how do we bridge that gap? How do we make the philosophers, act a little more mensch-like to the person next to them?
Absolutely. I think you bring up a very good point. Historically, there's a very paternalistic aspect to medicine. And particularly in Nazi Germany, we saw earlier, Hitler, the great doctor of the German people, and physicians in Nazi Germany were held to, in a much higher regard, which may explain why so many of them joined the Nazi Party. And so, I think that kind of continues today in terms of just the idea that if powerful people are telling you to do something, it's difficult to kind of go against that. And so in Nazi Germany, you had this scientific concept of eugenics, right, which was the idea that, and it made a lot of sense at the time. We say pseudoscience now, but a little bit that's like Monday morning quarterbacking, right? At the time, that was the best we had. That was, we were working off of real scientific data. We thought this made sense, and we can make a better society. So it's kind of a double whammy. And you took this scientific theory, and you were also able to use it within the politicization of medicine. We were able to use science kind of to meet the ideals of National Socialism. And so I think, there's a lot of danger there that we can see for everybody, not just physicians, but for everybody, for physicians, for patients, for the general population. And so, propaganda, which I know is something that, Ira, you've discussed in other instances, the economic burden of the unfit, kind of the use of doctors as agents of death for the state. So what lessons can we learn about the way in which medicine is perceived in society and the dangers that are inherent in assuming that healers are above kind of some of these things? They couldn't possibly kill people because, they took an oath. They took an oath. So how could this happen? What does it mean today in terms of the safety for patients in this complex multicultural society that we live in? Go ahead, Arit.
So let me just get this out because I'm going to put this again. Okay. So I come from a very stoic family and a very private family, and it is really, really not my usual thing to speak about personal experiences. It's much easier to address things in a general sense, but I decided that today is a very special forum, and in this context, I wanted to tell you what made this topic become so personally meaningful to me. So what made it so meaningful to me was my experiences